So the way I look at life in general is that life is about motion, about movement, about change. It's like the outside of the wheel. And I think if you're a Buddhist, you take it the wheel of samsara, which is it's constantly turning. There's always something churning, something changing. But we have to find the stillness at the center of that wheel. It's like in our breath. Each out breath is part of a cycle. When we get to the end of the out breath, there's a small pause. There's a place of stillness, if you like, before we take the next in breath. So every cycle in nature has these places of stillness, if we can find them. Between each thought, if we're meditating, there is a place of stillness. And, we're needing to find that center. And what I'm going to talk about today is those ways in which our ancestors and ourselves have found to help them find that stillness, to find that groundedness, to find that sense of being here now in the present. And we've got to think of religion and spirituality as being thousands of generations old, older than we can imagine. And it's only very recently that in some sense we've got more confused and lost around that. In the past, there's been a sense of a community of belief in which people could actually enjoy their own inner experience. Maybe some of that was, how should I say, not so healthy, but it always had that inner aspect of it. So there's a natural heritage that we have, a heritage of spirituality, of what I call the inner nature of religion, which adds a lot of richness, a lot of groundedness, a lot of kind of solidity to our experience. We tend to think of spirituality as kind of out there, kind of almost like dissociated, but actually spirituality is really about here and it's now, and it's very useful, it's very practical, and it doesn't cost anything. That's the thing that's so strange. We don't use this thing which is free. We can do something right now. And why don't we? Well, there's forces inside ourselves and outside of ourselves which kind of distract us from that. So my intention in this discussion, I would wish it was more of a discussion, this presentation, is to leave you with lots of questions. I don't have any answers, but I'd like to just stimulate some questions in your mind. Like, what do I do? How do I do it? Why don't I do that? Why do I do this? Why is this a part of my life? Why is it not a part of my life? Those are the questions we need to really address constantly. How do I make my experience, my inner experience, more rich, more vivid? How can I open my mind to new possibilities? And how can I be more uncertain? I know that sounds strange. Certainty is problematic, and I'll talk quite a bit about that. Uncertainty is where we need to be. This is a very uncertain time, and we need to embrace that uncertainty and not try to get some sort of way of capturing it, because that's what the ego always needs to do, is to control things. We have to let go a little bit. So the approach I take is more or less from a kind of Jungian approach. So it's not really in some sense religious. And I'll just talk a lot about the ego and the self. And if anybody is a Jungian or has some idea of Jungian concepts, the self is the whole of us. It's all aspects of ourselves, conscious and unconscious. The ego is the conscious part, and it's a very small part. It isn't who we are. We're much more than that. And we have to connect to that greater self, if you like, and feel that we're a part of a collective humanity, that we're linking in, if you like, to archetypal behaviors, things which have been part of humanity's collective experience for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They're really there, they're inside of us, and they're not that hard for us to access. And basically, the thing that I'm going to emphasize most is that the essence of all of these practices is just quietening your mind, opening your heart, and letting go of the kind of selfishness, the clinging of the ego and the demands of the outer world. So this would be a time where I would really like to have a discussion, but we're not going to have a discussion, and I'm afraid I'm going to do a slideshow. So let's see if I can get that. So spokes of the sacred wheel. This is the stillness in the center. And those are the practices that I'm familiar with. Now, there are other practices which I'm not familiar with. But let me just start with the kind of how I approach this from a more kind of academic and intellectual way. So my approach is a mixture of Karen Armstrong, and I'm assuming that some of you do know Karen Armstrong, an amazing writer, a religious historian, an amazing person, started the Charter for Compassion. And her books really do, they kind of make you think. So her Case for God, which is one of her more recent books by Karen Armstrong. So she's talking about human beings as fundamentally religious in the sense that we all have a sense of the sacred. We have a sense of something greater than ourselves if we're not tangled up in our own egos, and that religion has been part of human experience really since the beginning of time. So she talks about religion in a very specific way. First of all of the religious texts cannot be taken literally. They have to be taken symbolically, metaphorically. And most religions are really not about thinking. They're not about belief. They're about doing. They're about practice. Okay. So these are some quotes from her. Religion is a matter of doing rather than thinking. And the ultimate, whatever it is we believe the ultimate, we cannot access that with our rational discursive mind. And we can't access that through our ego. The ego is not designed for that. It is designed to be incredibly effective in the outer world. And that's its job. The difficulty is that it wants to take over everything. It has, if you like, a need for control, a need to be special, and a need to just interfere where it shouldn't interfere. So I want you to talk about beliefs. Beliefs limit us. They keep us locked into the shell of the ego. And there's a saying that I say to myself, which helps me remember that, which is, thinking is the voice of the ego. That means all the stuff that's going on in our heads, that's from the ego. Okay? And beliefs are the bones of the ego. Beliefs are what really hold the ego together. And now we can tell that the beliefs are problematic. We've just gone through an election where you can see people's beliefs have been so problematic. And we have to think of our own beliefs as being problematic as well. Certainly, we do not really have a sense of what reality is, only through the ego. And any of you who are Buddhists will know the parable of the poison arrow, which is Buddha's explanation about when there was a whole lot of things. Well, does this exist? God exist? How are we meant to think about this? And the Buddha's parable of the poison arrow is like, if you've got a poison arrow stuck in you, you don't need to know who shot it. You don't need to know what kind of bow they had. You don't need to know how tall they are. You don't need to know all of those things. That's the discursive mind doing its thing. You just want to get the arrow out. And the Buddha is very clear. Life is suffering, not in the sense of suffering all the time, but it's not satisfactory. We have dissatisfaction built into us. And when we're thinking about the ego thinks it has a grip on reality, but of course it doesn't. In fact, we live in a fantasy land all the time. And Zoom is a great analogy for this fantasy that we have. So at this moment, am I talking to people? Am I? I don't know. Am I talking to a group of consciousnesses out there, each of which has their own experience, each of which is making something different out of the words that I'm saying? Or really, am I just talking to this computer, this piece of whatever it is? I don't know, metal and plastic and all sorts of odd things. And I've got these little pixelated pictures of people, which may or may not be related to the people, but I'm pretending that they are. And you're pretending that there really is a person back here. But in fact, this is basically how the ego constructs reality. It's kind of like Zoom. So it's a cunning device. That's the way I think about it. And can we, in this group of people, can we feel each other? How do we do that through Zoom? How do we actually reach beyond the screen to actually feel as though there really is somebody out there? This is not easy. You know, how do we feel the presence of other people when they're not actually close to us? Okay, so let me just move on to a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about individuation. So some of you will understand Jung's idea of individuation, but it's not very complicated. And I think it's a kind of useful model because it takes us away from any of the ideas that we have, which we picked up when we're young. Basically, you got the ego and you got the self. And what we need is have the ego more permeable to the influence and guidance of the self. And the self, you might say, includes the soul, or you might say it's Atman, or you might say it's Buddha nature, or it might say whatever you want to call it. The words are really unimportant, but it's definitely bigger and more expansive than the ego. It includes our body. It includes the energy around us. It includes sometimes our relationships. And individuation is to become who you truly are. It's not to become somebody else. It's not to transcend yourself. And it's not even about being a saint, but it's about being complete, about being whole, about really knowing this is me, this is my ego, and this is the self. I have the sense of that self. And this is one of the quotes from Jung. Individuation is a heroic and often tragic task. This is not easy. The ego suffers in the journey, the spiritual journey, because it feels as though it's being undermined. Spirituality is undermining in some sense to the ego, so it resists. And here's his kind of simplest definition of individuation. It's coming to selfhood, self-realization. So we're on a journey, and we've got to move beyond the restrictions of our beliefs and the shell which kind of captures us, which is around our ego. All of those expectations, all of those thoughts, all of those beliefs, which actually are not particularly helpful for us. So I'm getting a little bit behind here. So I'm hoping, right. So let me talk about the types of practices that I'm going to go to in detail. So I think of these as two kinds of practices: inner practices and what I call outer supporting practices. The inner practices are common to every single religion. They're prayer and their meditation stroke contemplation. In Christianity, many people don't know that contemplation is the same as meditation. It's just a different word. And meditation is definitely not, in Christianity, is not the same as meditation, say, in a Buddhist sense or in a Hindu sense. So those are the inner practices. Those are the practices of stillness and quiet. And then there's outer supporting practices, where things you can do on the outside which actually help you get to that place of quietness. And the most common, of course, is ritual and ceremony. And I'm not going to talk about that because that's definitely not my experience. I don't know anything about it. I'm not part of an institutional religion. So ritual is very important, very powerful, and I know that it works for many people. It's nothing I know about. Fasting, I've talked about, retreat, pilgrimage. These are things which I do actually have a sense of. So I think, let me move on. And what do these spiritual practices share? Okay, they're ancient, they're very old, and they're independent of particular belief systems. You've got to think of them as universals, archetypes, part of the collective. They all shift awareness from ego to self. And of course, that will be defined in different ways in the different religions because they will have different kinds of ways of putting that. But my way is saying, okay, from my ego to myself. They induce a quiet mind and an open heart. And they're oriented towards transformation, not just change. So when we're thinking about psychotherapy, psychotherapy is a lot about change, trying to change people's attitudes, their beliefs, the way they behave, so they're more functional. And in that sense, most of what we do in psychotherapy is really about ego strengthening. Why do we need to do ego strengthening? Because if your ego is not strong enough, it will never let go. It will never let go. And we know that that's true, that when we feel insecure, when we feel inadequate, we basically close the gates of the ego to anything from outside. So until the ego is strong enough, till it's settled, spirituality is very problematic. And it is for many, many people. So there's always this tension between the ego and the self. And that's something which we are going to take most of our life to resolve. Okay. And in spiritual practices, I'm a gardener, so I think of it like gardening, which is you till the ground, you make it the best possible ground you can, you plant the seeds, you back off. Now, I have actually dug up seeds to see if they're growing because they were so slow. And I think that's something that, in a spiritual sense, we often can do, which we overthink it, that we're kind of picking at our own spirituality. We're digging up those seeds and we're not giving them the time and the space to actually grow. Because what makes them grow is something beyond our capacity. Can't control it. It's what I would call the life force. And the life force is inherent in everything. And if you're a gardener, every time a plant actually grows, it's kind of like a miracle. You just don't know how it happens. So I'm always shocked that actually I actually managed to get things to grow. And what do spiritual practices require? Now, I'm leaning heavily now on some of the writing of Zalman Schachter Shalomi. He wrote a very beautiful book, but it's kind of impossible to read because lots of it's in Hebrew. So it's called davening. Davening is the Jewish word for prayer, and it's the kind of inner way of practicing prayer in a Jewish context. And he has a whole chapter on what he calls kavanah. It doesn't quite exactly translate from the Hebrew into English, but it basically has kind of the feeling of you've got to pray with intention. You've got to do your spiritual practice with this strong sense of intention. And it has to have a meaning and a focus, an orientation towards something. And it needs to have that humility where you're putting the ego aside. And you're often putting aside the need for it to do anything. And that's hard for the ego. The ego is very goal-oriented. It wants to say, well, if I pray 3 times a day for 6 weeks, then I'm going to become enlightened. I remember I did have a very strange experience when I was young. I actually did think, well, if I do my spiritual practice really, really well, I should actually be enlightened in my 20s, shouldn't I? That's the ego doing its whole kind of inflation piece around spirituality. And of course, you get a little glimpse every now and again. And 50 years later, you're just beginning at the beginning again. You're just beginning to think, oh, okay, I think I'm actually now got a sense of what it is I'm about. But I certainly haven't got anywhere. So intention and meaning are really fundamental to any spiritual practice. There's a word niyyah, I think that's how it's pronounced in Arabic, which is when you're a Muslim and you do the ritual prayers each day, the salah, you actually start with your intention. If you do not have an intention, it's not a prayer. Okay. So the other thing is balancing effort and surrender. This is an important piece. We have to engage the ego. We've got to get that ego on track and deciding to do something. We have to make an effort, but then we've got to let go. Because I have come across so many people who will say, yes, I meditate, basically 20 minutes a day. I don't seem to be getting anywhere, but I'm going to keep doing it. And it's like, you need to back off a bit, actually. And sometimes I'll say to people, well, why don't you try 2 minutes? 2 minutes might work actually better than 20 minutes. And why don't you do it like a few times a day rather than just this one time? Because the ego has get stuck in way of thinking about it. I have to do this in order for this to happen. In our inner life, it doesn't work like that. So we have to make an effort, but we can't have expectations. Any of you who know the Bhagavad Gita, that's one of the main themes of the Bhagavad Gita. We need to act. We have to be involved, but we have to let go of the fruits of our action. We have to let go of these goals. We have to not cling and be attached to it doing something. And that's particularly true when we're talking about spirituality. So the other thing, of course, when we have a practice, we've got to make a commitment. This is a difficult thing for many people. So intention has that sense of commitment, that we actually commit to it. And not only do we commit to it, but we remember. I have difficulty remembering. And I think as we get older, we all have difficulty remembering. And so I actually have a big whiteboard in my office and I write things on it so that I can look at it and remind myself, okay, maybe I should just take a moment to get quiet. I also remind myself when I'm in the car, okay, am I in the car or am I out of the car? Am I actually feeling my hands on the wheel, or has my mind already gone to where I'm going to, and I've worked out all of these things, and then I'm thinking about what I'm going there, and actually I'm not anywhere. I'm not in the car. I'm somewhere else. We've got to kind of bring ourselves back into the present. And that's where intention and attention are very linked. Intention is what directs our attention towards certain things. Okay, I think that's probably enough on this one. So, how are we doing? What is prayer? When I was in, kindergarten and then in primary school, we had prayers. We went to the church and we went to mass, and there was all of these prayers, and they were all in Latin, of course. Which actually, now that I look back, I really enjoyed the Latin much better than the English because I didn't know what it was about, but it sounded great. But prayer is the most common, it's the most natural practice. Often we pray without knowing that we're praying. We think of praying as somehow saying these set formula of words, Our Father who art in heaven, whatever it is, or as I remember it as Pater Noster qui es in Caeli, which is the Latin, or the Hail Mary, if you're a Catholic, or all of those things. And we think of them as kind of these demands or these requests that we make of this some person somewhere up there. And that's a very childish piece, but it's not wrong. It's just not big enough. Prayer is really about connecting to ourselves through connecting to something greater than ourselves. It's moving outside of the ego. And that's why, in some sense, you could say this, the God idea, as I said, the idea of God is actually useful for many people because it allows them to get outside of themselves and not just be in themselves. So we need to connect to ourselves through connecting to something greater than ourselves. It's very ancient, and it's the act of communing. But I always think that it's communing with myself, in some sense projected. Jung would say that the God image is deep within our unconscious. It's deep in the collective unconscious. And when we think of God out there, really we're connecting to this God image, which is deep inside. But it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you do it. So prayer has an aspiration, often towards purification, to become a better person, and towards transcendence, to become greater, to become better, to become greater. Um, and we can't be stuck on this idea of prayer as like, okay, there's a set thing of prayer, and I never do that. Prayer to me is when you look at something with wonder that is prayerful. When you have that sense of yearning for something greater than yourself, whether you call it God or whatever, that's prayer. It's got that sense of intention of moving outside of yourself. This is my favorite quote about prayer from Reb Zalman. True prayer is a bursting forth of the soul to God. What can be more natural and more human? Prayer is one of the simplest and easiest of practices. And when you read how Zalman talks about prayer, it's so full of him. If you knew him, it's like his voice comes through because it's so authentically him. It's his experience. It's not some theory that he has about prayer. It's actually what he did, maybe still does, every single day for long periods of time. There was all these set prayers, and then there's the kind of contemplative prayers, and there's all these kind of prayers, most of which I have no idea about because they're all in Hebrew. But they had so much meaning and so much intention for him. It's really true when you read the book. This is about experience. This isn't just kind of some sort of theory. As I say, this one chapter on kavanah, or intention, is an extraordinary chapter. Here's some more quotes. These are Christian quotes. The great method of prayer is to have none. And prayer is the raising of the mind to God. The actual words matter less. That's Pope John the 23rd. Words are really not what prayer is. The words carry your intention. They carry your focus. They're, if you like, carrier waves. But the prayer itself is the raising. It's the orientation towards something greater. And the difficulty we have for the ego is that once we get beyond the ego, it feels like emptiness. It feels like nothing. It feels like there's nothing to cling on to, because that aspect of the self, which is truly surrendered and still, is empty of thoughts. It's empty of all sorts of things. So it's a kind of a scary place for many people. And in Christian tradition, of course, there is the idea of the dark night of the soul. If you're on a mystical path, there are some real difficulties on that path because the ego gets freaked, basically. I'm just going to go through these quickly, but there's the kinds of prayer. Help me, help, help, help. That's the most common prayer. Help me or help them. Praying for other people. To me, that's actually a very sweet prayer. I always used to think that was very childish, and now I don't. Now I think actually it's kind of the basis of all prayer, which is like, I really do need help. I can't do this alone. I need some help. So petition or intercession, those are called. Thanksgiving, just like I'm grateful, I'm thankful. And if you talk to most people who pray a lot, they will say that's the primary prayer for them. It's being grateful, starting with gratitude and then moving on to something else, which is, I'm grateful for being alive. And of course, you could say, I don't know, some Buddhists among you will say, there's this part where you say, this body I have, this life I have is very hard to get. Maybe I've had to work many, many lifetimes to get this lifetime. Maybe I've had to be in different realms, and I better make the most of it. I should be grateful for actually having this life, having this body. Confession. Confession is about what we talked about, kind of inner purification. Forgive me, I am not the kind of person I want to be. I am not living up to my aspirations. I am finding myself struggling to be kind. I'm finding myself angry and intolerant, and I don't want to be. So I need to somehow let go of that. I have to forgive myself. And through kind of asking for forgiveness, I can forgive myself. It's kind of a two-way street because, as I say, God is not out there. Whatever God is, it has to be inside. Praise, adoration. I always like this one. You're great. Allahu Akbar. You know, that is the main prayer of Islam. God is the greatest, is the most great, you know. And if you ever in a Muslim country, you will hear that said endlessly. The muezzins will say it from their towers, their minarets, or whatever they're called. And they're trying to remind us, okay, remember this. Of course, if you're Jewish, then you've got the kind of fundamental prayer, which is kind of a praise, kind of adoration. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, which means, you know, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe. And then you stick whatever you want on the end, for giving me life. And I know Zalman always used to talk about his first prayer in the morning, which is for letting my tubes work in the morning. I need to praise God for letting my tubes work when I can go to the bathroom in the morning. But in Jewish tradition, you praise God for everything. There is thousands of prayers that you can do, and they all have that same form. You know, blessed are you, Lord our God, and this sense of both praise, adoration. And then, if you like, oh, and I'm thinking about, I've got a little note here. Don't forget the Buddhist prayers. Om Mani Padme Hum, which is actually, I don't even know how it translates. I do remember it from when I was a Buddhist, long, long time ago. You know, I think it's something like hail to the jewel in the lotus, something like that, but it doesn't translate very well. But that is not officially a prayer because there is nobody that a Buddhist would pray to, but it is a prayer. It's got the quality of intention. It's got the quality of attention. It's quality of orientation to something greater. So it's a prayer. And then there's in kind of traditional Christianity, in Islam, in let me think, in Judaism, the Baha'is, all sorts of other ones, contemplative mystical prayer is, as I say, the question mark. It isn't about anything. In some sense, it's as close to being empty of all things. And any of you who know the cloud of unknowing, that's kind of the fundamental Christian piece of literature on contemplative mystical prayer. And that's where we want to get to. We can use prayer as like a step ladder to get to something which is empty. And of course, some of you have come across centering prayer. Centering prayer is based on the cloud of unknowing, and Father Thomas Keating, he made it popular. He died last year, which was very sad. And the monastery where he lived, which is up in Snowmass, was a place I would visit every year. You know, centering prayer is basically using the techniques the monks have always used and now making it available to people outside of monasteries. If you're in the Orthodox tradition, anybody who knows about the Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, the Jesus prayer is the fundamental prayer. It's a contemplative prayer. The beautiful little pamphlet almost about that is The Way of a Pilgrim. Way of a Pilgrim is about this person's experience with the Jesus prayer. And he was wandering around. Jesus prayer is usually, of course, in Greek, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And it's part of the very powerful Christian Orthodox tradition of hesychasm. I don't know how you even pronounce that, hesychasm. It's about silence, stillness. It's an unbroken tradition which goes back to the Desert Fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century in North Africa and the Middle East. There's very powerful traditions in the Greek Orthodox, which we in the West don't really know very much about. Okay. So, what's meditation? Not knowing that much about it, some of you will actually find this, maybe he doesn't quite understand this. But there are different approaches. You can have, if you like, a meditation which is based on something that you do internally. So you could have a mantra meditation, or you could have a breath meditation, or you could have a body meditation. It's got some structure to it. But then you can have an openness meditation, which doesn't have much structure to it. I think Trungpa Rinpoche would, the founder of Naropa University, he suggested that people pay attention to the out-breath and to the end of the out-breath. The end of the out-breath is a place where we can be still. So it's got that thing of, well, it's kind of empty, but it's also got something that you pay attention to. You're disidentifying with the ego through quietening your mind, cultivating mindfulness. And mindfulness is a big topic nowadays. You know, if you want to know about it, there's lots to read. Open awareness, loving kindness. Loving kindness, people forget that meditation isn't really about a selfish thing that I'm going to get enlightened. And in fact, you know, many in the Mahayana tradition will talk about the bodhisattva vows, which is that I will not actually be enlightened until I have helped everybody else get enlightened. Loving kindness is fundamental to Buddhism, and being fully present in the moment. So quietening the mind, settling the heart. As I say, in the Orthodox tradition, this is called kenosis, or self-emptying. That's the contemplative prayer and the contemplative practices in the Greek Orthodox and the Christian Orthodox. And what you're doing, I think I said before, is as you get quieter, as your ego stops being so demanding, it becomes permeable to something else inside. Now, as I said, that's not got any form, but it is a form of guidance. Now, let me just say, I think, let me go. So here's a meditation quote. With every breath, the old moment is lost. A new moment arrives. We exhale and we let go of the old moment. This is meditation. So much of our time in the West, so much of our time, all of us, is not lived in the present. It's lived in the future, which is full of anxiety. It's lived in the past, which is either full of distress or nostalgia. But how present are we? This moment, right this moment. Now, am I here? Am I in this chair? Am I in front of the screen? It's a question we should ask ourselves all the time. That's meditation. It's not complicated. It's like, okay, I'm here. All right. And I don't have to think. That's really the essence of meditation. And in that sense, if we make it simpler, make it easier, yeah, we often need techniques to get to that place, but that's really what it's about. Some more quotes. Meditation is not a means to an end. It is both the means and the end. Krishnamurti. I was lucky enough to see Krishnamurti just a little bit before he died. He was not a happy man, I'm afraid. And I remember he was actually there giving his talk, and he was saying to all of these very holy looking people all sitting around him, his disciples, and he said to them almost like, stop meditating and be present. He was really irritated with these people because they had taken his ideas, which is about nothing. You know, he was not suggesting that we do anything except be totally present. When meditation is mastered, the mind is unwavering like a flame of a lamp in a windless place. The Bhagavad Gita is an amazing piece of literature. You know, whatever the time is, maybe 600 BC. I think that's about the time it was written. It's so full of kind of wisdom. It was the main book, of course, of Mahatma Gandhi. And he basically read it and read it and read it. And it talks a lot about meditation, but it also talks about action. It talks about meditation and action not being separate, that they are just kind of different aspects of the same thing. And that when we are active, we need to, in a sense, be meditating. And meditation, it's common to all Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Taoism has its own form, and in some Zen, and Zen meditation comes out of a mixture of Buddhism and Taoism. And as I said, Eastern Orthodox Christianity as well. Okay, let me see. So I think we're ready to break. So Barry, it's up to you. What we're going to do is break into small groups, smaller groups, And I want people to just think about these questions. What internal practices, the practices I've been talking about, am I drawn to? What feels natural to me? And how does that reflect who I am, my nature? You know, it's almost like asking, what's my path? What do I need to actually kind of pay attention to? So we'll have 15 minutes in our small groups. So Barry, can you do that for us?
Okay, I'm creating the 4 groups.
Okay, so this is the practice which I think has been most powerful and most beneficial for me when I was younger, particularly. I don't fast as much now, but I do fast occasionally. I just have to feel, okay, am I ready to do a little fast or not? So I think of it as the most powerful of all the practices, supporting practices. And of course, it's in every religion. Lent, which most people don't think of as a fast, but it was a fast. I mean, no, Lent. I mean, Advent. Lent and Advent. Advent used to be a fast. Ramadan, of course, I've done Ramadan many times, and it's very, very powerful and interesting fast. I've also done Lent. Yom Kippur, in fact, I fasted with my wife over Yom Kippur this year. And of course, Buddhists, monks, my brother's a Buddhist monk or was a Buddhist monk, and he was a pretty, what would I say? You don't really want to say fundamentalist, but he basically didn't eat after 12 o'clock every day. He had to only eat what he was given. So he was begging until 12, eating at 12, and then nothing after that. And that's a tradition in the Theravadan kind of forest order tradition. So let's talk about, oh, somebody's just needed admitting. So what is fasting? It's intentional surrender to physical and psychological discomfort. We're not torturing the ego, but we're weakening the ego. We're actually allowing the ego not to just have its own way. So fasting is in a simple way of basically curbing our desires, our needs, our wishes, our wants, and taking on the discomfort. And when you fast, you get empty. You get physically empty. But that emptiness then actually becomes a kind of psychological empty. And it becomes more spacious. Now, that's not to say that it happens every time, but if you do it regularly, then that emptiness, you can basically find that. There's a funny thing, the ego gets kind of a bit freaked out about fasting because it often says to you, like, I'm not going to be able to function. I won't be able to do what I need to do. It's going to mess with my life. It's going to mess with what I need to accomplish today. And that's actually, in some sense, it's just an illusion. Often during fasting, we're more effective. And some people who've done longer fasting will say that the clarity that it gives you is quite extraordinary. So the fear of fasting, I think, is very strong. The fear of self-denial is strong. And even though people will say, oh, well, I know it's good for you, they won't do it. It's hard for them to curb because the ego is fragile and therefore feels very threatened when it gets weaker. So the curbing of desires and compulsions, and particularly compulsions, when you fast, you really notice your compulsions. You know, if you're like me and you just love chocolate, then you start to think about chocolate a lot. And then you begin to think, that's really interesting. I didn't realize how addicted I was. Now I'm recognizing that addiction, that compulsive need for something, you know, the compulsive need to put something in our mouth whenever we don't feel comfortable. And the other thing which is really very useful about fasting is it develops some inner discipline. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're talking about prayer and we're talking about spiritual practice as having the quality of an intention. Well, how strong can we hold our intentions unless we have some inner discipline? So fasting helps us gain discipline. Um, if you ever want to check how strong your willpower is, there's some very interesting little tasks that you can try. We all know how difficult it is to get on, say, a diet or an exercise program, and how we struggle with that. But there's an exercise comes from Assagioli, which is an old psychologist. He says, okay, if you want to see how your willpower is, make a decision to stand on a chair for 1 minute every day in the morning and see how many days you'll do it. The average amount of days that people will do it is 1, because that's about the quality of our intention, of our ability to actually control and decide what we need to do. So fasting is very common in many traditions. Monday and Thursday in Islam, Greek Orthodox, it's Wednesdays and Fridays. As I say, there's lots of other, fasts, which are, bigger fasts. As I said, there's Buddhist fasts, there's Hindu fasts, which I don't need to go into too much because I don't know much about them. Let me see. So, fasting of the body is food for the soul. That's a very, St. John Chrysostom is one of the very ancient fathers of the church. And the light of the world will illuminate within you when you fast and purify yourself, Mahatma Gandhi. He was very big on fasting. And as you know, he used fasting as a tool, I would say almost as a manipulation, to get what he wanted. He was a very willful kind of guy, but it was quite amazing that he could have that sense of self-control to be able to really fast until he died if he wanted to. This looks as though something's gone wrong with this. No? Okay. Fasting quotes. If the brain and belly are burning clean with fasting, every moment a new song comes out of the fire. Rumi has this beautiful way of putting the experience into words, which is that things arise when you're fasting. The ego is more permeable, and therefore things come to you. And when the faculties are empty, then your whole being listens. So that's another aspect of fasting. So you may not have considered fasting, but it would be something that I would suggest is useful for everybody. If you've got some sort of illness like diabetes or something, you have to be very careful with fasting. But for most of us, we have plenty of extra body fat, and we can probably go for a very long time without eating anything. And we don't need to be frightened of that. So I'm going to talk about retreat now. And I'm moving through these pretty fast. So it's an intentional withdrawal from the world. It's moving into yourself. And I think Bill in our group was talking about having been on a Zen retreat, a Zoom Zen retreat for 7 days recently. So it's a time to really focus inwards and let the outside world just disappear. Not completely disappear, because we have to still take care of ourselves, but it isn't so pressing. And it's a time for silence and solitude. So one of the things we can think about it is that, what about the idea of a Sabbath? The Sabbath is a very powerful tradition in Christianity and in Judaism. It's when God rested, according to Genesis. When do we rest? When do we really rest? When do we take a whole day without what I call any expectations and any demands? I do that every Saturday. It's kind of, you could say it's selfish, and I had to get over that sense that it's selfish. But waking up in the morning, knowing that you're not going to make any demands of yourself, that you're just going to go with whatever happens, whatever needs to happen, that you're not going to have other people's expectations move you around. And it helps you recognize those internal voices which push us around, which force us to be productive. We live in a society where not to be productive is a sin. It's a mortal sin in Catholic terms. It's really just not allowed. You're not allowed not to be productive. You've got to be productive all the time. And actually doing nothing is not allowed unless you're maybe recreating, which is a very weird word, or watching television. So the other piece which retreat helps you with is engaging with the ego's need for distraction and entertainment. We all slip into distraction. Particularly in this COVID age where, okay, well, there's television, or there's actually Netflix, not even television anymore. I can just kind of sit down with my favorite program and I don't have to think. And there's nothing wrong with that. That actually is recuperating for the ego, but there needs to be time when it's not ego time. And so we need that time of reconnecting with ourselves and renewal, of getting quiet. And recognizing the struggle to do nothing. How many of us feel comfortable just sitting in a chair doing nothing, not even meditating? Because sometimes meditating becomes something. And the cultural conditioning is very strong. And there's a kind of inner agitation that it brings up. So here's some retreat quotes. This is my favorite one. This is from Kabir. Kabir is such a wonderful poet, and has got a really kind of almost like vicious sense of humor about these things. I felt in need of a great pilgrimage, so I sat still for 3 days and God came to me. I didn't need to go to God, because if you're quiet, then you get it. It will happen for you. Within you, there is a stillness and sanctuary to which you can retreat at any time and be yourself. Hermann Hesse. Many of us, at least in my generation, Hesse was a very, very powerful kind of mentor even. His books really just changed your mind. Siddhartha, Narcissus and Goldmund, some of the others, Peter Kamen-Zinn, all of these books, they were really powerful. And his writings, his short writings, are very sweet. There's nothing so much like God in all the universe as silence. Silence and retreat go together. Can I be silent? Silent not only in my outer world, but in my inner world. How do I find that silence? How do I find that lack of distraction? Because that's the center. That's where we need to go sometimes. All right, so I'm moving on quickly through all of these. Pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is absolutely fascinating once you start doing some research and once you start getting into it. It is, as I say, another intentional practice that you're going somewhere with a purpose. It has an inner meaning. It's not just like, well, that's nice. I've done, 20 different sites today, and now I can get back in the tour bus and go and see some more. That's kind of a bit like overeating. It's like eating 3 bags of chips sometimes. You just feel absolutely full. So it has to, if you have an inner meaning, it kind of clarifies that. It slows you down. The other thing about pilgrimage is that traditionally it's meant to be difficult. It's not meant to be totally easy. There has to be a quality of ordeal. And you maybe have gone on the Camino, and that's not a very comfortable thing for your feet and your knees and your whatever. There are times when you just feel very uncomfortable, but it's got that quality, which is like, I have made this intention and I am going to see it through, and I am going to meet these challenges. I'm going to test myself. Yeah. And in that sense, it's like, the Jungian idea of the hero's journey, whose name escapes at this moment. A lot about the human. Somebody will probably be able to tell me. And the hero's journey is a journey of transformation. It's actually going somewhere on purpose and being transformed and being changed by that experience. And the last thing, which is really true, is that when you go to some sacred sites, and I can't say all of them, they have a certain resonance. They have a certain atmosphere, a certain energy, however you want to call it. Some of them are very powerful. Some of them are very quieting. Some of them are a little freaky. I remember actually the hair standing up on my back of my neck when I went into a service in Notre Dame de Paris, which is now, of course, not functioning. But that place had that sense of ancient energy, which was kind of a little freaky, actually, dark, but also spiritual, different. Few places I've been to. If you've ever been to Iona in Scotland, where Christianity came from Ireland to England, that is a place which has so much, just a beautiful feeling. And I found myself going there just by accident many, many years ago. Pilgrimages are something that human beings have always done and still do in vast quantity. We don't recognize, but 155 to 250 million people go on pilgrimage every year. Think of that. That's bigger than many, many countries. It's bigger than lots of the states. Why it fluctuates wildly is that particularly for Hindus, there's these big, every 12 years, there's a very big pilgrimage where it might have 120 million people. If you can imagine 120 million people all in one place, kind of scary, actually. But they are really into their pilgrimages. Muslims, the biggest pilgrimage isn't to Mecca. It's not the Hajj. That's only 2 to 3 million. The biggest one is actually a Shia pilgrimage in Iraq, which has over 20 million people do it every year. Christians, the biggest one, and actually all of the biggest ones are about Mary. They're all about Our Lady. It's Our Lady of Guadalupe. There's the ones to Fatima, to Lourdes. These are, and there's Knock in Ireland. These are all ones where, the Virgin Mary was meant to have appeared. And they're the ones that attract most. So you could actually say, well, in that sense, oh, okay, Catholicism is really much more about the goddess than it is about God. But, you can have arguments about that. And, there's a whole tradition of, Canterbury Tales. All of us have probably read the Canterbury Tales, or at least know about it, because everybody went to Canterbury Cathedral, which was a famous place to go to on pilgrimage. And we used to live very close to Canterbury, and we used to go to Canterbury Cathedral quite regularly. And it is an extraordinary place. I highly recommend, as I say, pilgrimages. So I think I'm coming to the end of this. Oh, I got some quotes here. The object of pilgrimage is not rest and recreation. As I said, there's an ordeal quality to it. There's an efforting quality. To set out on a pilgrimage is to throw down a challenge to everyday life. It's to really actually look at how much ease, comfort we take for granted. How much we are kind of like wedded to our predictable, ordinary life. When we go on pilgrimage, we are actually expecting the unexpected, because there's a saying, God appears in the unexpected, because if you expect it, then it has to come from your mind. It has to come from your ego, because the ego is the master of expectation. If it comes from the self or comes from outside of the self, it will come unexpectedly. It will not be something that you can control. And this quote from Thomas Merton: the geographical pilgrimage is the symbolic acting out of an inner journey. What practices do I want to do more of? I want you to think about that. That's just a question. And how could I make those practices part of my life?